Decolonisation of Africa following World War II brought independence to many countries, but also a lot of violence in the form of civil wars, insurgencies and the like. Entire generations of young men were called upon to take part in various military efforts. My guest today was very much part of that. He spent many years fighting for the South African Defence Forces, and he has a particularly unique story to tell. Wynand du Toit, welcome to Tales Less Told.
Thank you, Richard.
Now, Wynand, in 1985 you were a young fellow. You were the son of a farmer. You could have been on the farm, you could have been at a bar with some buddies, but instead you were in a submarine lying in wait off the Angolan coast. What were you doing there?
Enjoying the scenery.
Oh yeah.
But okay, now, first off, Richard, I would like to say that I'm not part of the decolonization since the World War II. I'm not that older. But yeah, things did rapidly change since 1960 in Africa, and there was a few countries that were sort of holding out, which the main ones were basically Portugal, with the Portuguese colonies, which was just north of our territories. We received, after the First World War, a mandate, a so-called sea mandate, to protect and look after Southwest Africa, which later on became Namibia. And when the Portuguese left Angola, there was a big vacuum created, and we had all the SWAPO fighters, the Plan fighters, the People for the People's Army for the Liberation of Namibia. Sorry for that one, but I'm actually Afrikaans. But so they just moved in, and we had to protect the borders, protect the farmers. And it was, of course, a war that touched every family in South Africa. It was not a war that we wanted initially, but it was a war that was forced upon us, first initiated on request by the United States to involve ourselves in Angola after the withdrawal of the Portuguese, to support the pro-Western group of rebels, which was UNITA, under Dr. Jonas Savimbi. And eventually we got caught up in this war back home. We introduced national service, which was then lengthened to a time period of 2 years that every white South African had to do national service. It became so part of our family life and the way how you do things that for us it was something to look forward to. When we were youngsters, we wanted to go. We wanted to go into the military. The military at that stage offered a very good career. You talked about growing up on the farm, and I could have gone to the farm, but being one of 3 brothers, only one can farm, and the rest got to do something else. Eventually nobody of us went to the farm. But I became involved, and you ask about the submarine on the west coast of Africa. I eventually became part of 4 Reconnaissance Regiment, which was the seaborne unit of the South African Special Forces, very much similar to the British Special Boat Service, the BSB. In contrast with the SAS, which was the Special Air Service. So we specialized in reconnaissance, infiltrating from warships, and especially submarines. Submarines, of course, for smaller groups of teams that is needed, especially reconnaissance operations, going into harbors, deploy from the submarine with rubber boats, and then drive into the night, go and take photographs and measurements and do what we have to do. but that specific time that you are talking about now, in 1985, we were on our way to destroy 6 massive oil tanks in Cabinda. Now Cabinda geographically is not part of Angola. It's an enclave, a province of Angola, but a part of the DRC is coming between Angola mainland and then this enclave. So Cabinda got their own resistance fighters, and they're still operating today, FLAC. And they worked for the independence of Cabinda from the larger Angola. Now Cabinda is very rich in oil, and the oil there are being harvested, pumped out, harvested by the Gulf company, Cabinda Gulf, which is an American company, United States company. We received, the first time we received instructions to destroy that oil storage facility during 1983. Yet 2 years passed before we get the final go-ahead to destroy the tanks. I cannot help but to ask the question, why? Why would we attack our only ally in the Western world, their facility? Why would we anger the Americans who have been using their vote in the Security Council of the United Nations to protect us? If you go back in history, you will see that the day after that failed attack was the day that America finally cut their ties with the old South Africa. I couldn't help but ask, was this operation authorized on the highest level in South Africa, or was it used to force the previous government of P.W. Botha to surrender more quickly the power? So our main target at that stage was to attack the American oil installation in Cabinda. We infiltrated by submarine. Of course, the Daphne class submarines which we used is French origin, fairly old submarines, and according to Jane's fighting ships and all records that they have, a submarine cannot travel that fast, or a Daphne class submarine. But we, the South Africans, have modified the submarine so that we can travel to there and back without a problem. And the submarine is a clandestine weapon, safe to infiltrate with, and is hardly seen. As long as you don't appear in the same spot for more than 3 nights, you are fairly safe. What happened then was that we infiltrated on the night of the 20th of May 1985. There was 2 limitations put on the operation, which I must first discuss. The first one was that we were not allowed to compromise the seawork capabilities of the South African Defence Force. So we were told not to land inside the installation because it's open on the seaside. We could have even swum in, enter the facility without even cutting one fence, do our job, and be back aboard the submarine in 6 hours. Instead, they said we had to land in a little bay of Malembu up north, which was 21 kilometers away from the target. The Gulf itself, where they produced the oil from the sea, was very shallow. Average depth of about 22 meters. A submarine needs at least 25 meters to operate in, so we had to launch very far away from the coast. Where we normally would have launched on 3 sea miles off the coast, we now had to do it on 12 sea miles from the coast. So now we got a very long leg to infiltrate by boat, And then we got another 21 kilometers to walk to the target. Then we have to attack the target. We have to come back all the way. And there was not enough hours in the night to execute the operation. So now that forced us to stay one day ashore. But just remember, we were now 2,000 kilometers behind enemy lines. We are 2,000 kilometers north of the Angolan-Namibian border, where the rest of the South African Defence Force was deployed at the time. So there's no assistance. No one can come to your aid. If there's a problem, you are stuck. Because in daytime, the submarine has gone down to the bottom. It bottomed itself. And it was lying there, no radio communication, nothing until nightfall. So it was a risky operation. And we infiltrated as we were told to and how we have planned. It was difficult, it was getting late. We get into the laying up position very late at night.
So, sorry, you deployed from the submarine?
Yes.
That's right. How many guys are we talking about?
We were 9 guys, they deployed, and there were 6 guys alternative or more personnel on the boats, which manned the boats.
Yep.
3 in each boat. And then the attack team, which was 9 people. Yeah, eventually, of course, the guys on the boats got away. They got back to the ship the same night.
And what was your role?
I was the mission commander.
Mission commander.
Yeah.
What rank does that equal in the
I was a major, a captain. A captain. Sorry, I became a major shortly afterwards. I was a captain at that stage.
Yeah. Just one more question about that. You didn't want to betray, or rather your higher up powers said that they didn't want to betray the seaward capabilities of the South African Navy. Therefore, it had to look like you came in from land somehow.
Yes.
So was the enemy meant to think that you had parachuted in or something or other?
Yeah, the cover story was that we parachuted into Zaire, which is now the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And as the crow flies, it's 75 kilometers from the border. Because the enclave is long and actually very small. It's in total, I think, 125 kilometers from north to south and 75 from east to west. So the cover story was we parachuted into Zaire. We crossed the border into Cabinda from the east, and then we walked to the facility. And that's why the second limitation that was put on the operation is that we must lay up. Our height for the day must be on the eastern side of the installation to create that impression. But the eastern side of the installation only had one proper place where you can hide. So all this, the 2 limitations, the 1 limitation forced us to spend the day ashore. We could have done this operation in 6 hours, max. Forced us to stay a day ashore. The second limitation put us in a spot. There's already 3 questions that need to be asked. Why American target? Why so isolated? Why a day ashore? Why on the eastern side?
Okay, 2 more questions. Was it meant to be a deniable operation? If the things blow up and everyone's saying, who did this?
Of course.
And what was the idea that, it must have been UNITA?
Yes. We had a lot of UNITA pamphlets with us, and all UNITA equipment, UNITA uniforms, and everything was UNITA. UNITA was to take the honors for this operation. Of course, that was in the eyes of the soldiers who have planned it, but there were certain alternative motives behind everything. But of course, the South African government immediately denied it, and they said, well, we are actually on a reconnaissance mission to find out more about SWAPO and ANC bases in Cabinda, which we knew before the time is not the case anyway. There's no one of them in Cabinda itself. But yes, the target was the oil tanks.
And in terms of the planning, excuse me, the planning, you said that there were those two provisos that you had to work towards. Who were those? Who was dictating those rules to you?
Well, it came to us through intelligence lines, military intelligence, who gave certain guidelines for the operation of what they want to do, and of course all the photographs, everything that we used in the operation came from them as well. And then of course there was the situation where the what's the right word, but the selection of the hide, the position of the hide is my priority. And under normal circumstances we will decide, I will decide where we lay up. But I was told by Chief of the Defence Force that I will lay up on the eastern side.
The Chief of the Defence Force?
Yeah. Oh. I was told that you guys will lay up on the eastern side, and they have actually indicated the place where we did lay up, but that was an isolated spot. And this is perhaps one of the very few operations where we were absolutely 100% dictated about where to spend the day. And that is what raised questions in my mind all the years after, after the completion of the operation, after the guys came back, after I came back from prison.
Yep.
That was the questions I asked, and I never had the answers on that.
So in all those early planning stages, you have your 9 fellows of the assault team and the other guys who are involved in the who are also part of the broader team. Was there a feeling of unease in those planning and preparation stages? That something didn't feel quite right?
Definitely. Especially the fact that we had to spend a day ashore. We wanted to go in and out into the installation, the oil installation, and out that way, without cutting one single fence. That's what we wanted to do. That was the logical thing to do. I also afterwards thought about it. When we attacked the Beira oil installations in Mozambique, we landed inside the installation. When we attacked the oil installation in Luanda, we landed inside the installation. Lubito inside. When we attacked Namib Harbor in 1986, the guys, they went into the harbor. Why was that same limitation not part of those other operations?
Were those,
why specific this operation?
Was the Cabinda enclave the furthest
of
all
highest
of those
up north? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Lots of questions there, but let's go back to the operation itself.
Yeah, lots of questions. But anyway, we moved into position quite late during the night. And we walked through a lot of grass that was wet, wet, and you could actually saw our approach. You can see it in the grass, which for many years led the impression that we were too late. That's why there's a dew print. But recent years, I've been farming in that area, and I find out that the dew already starts appearing on the grasses from 11 at night, 11, 12 at night. So here is also a thing that we were not prepared, I think, to operate under those conditions, those humidity, those wet climate. We were not prepared. We did not know how late does the dew fall. And that type of thing. But when the sun came up that morning, when we looked out of the height, we could see at least 2 FAPLA camps which wasn't there during the reconnaissance. So now I start asking the question, why did it took 2 years from when I first received the order to do it? Why did it take 2 years before we finally executed? What had to come into place? There's something to bear in mind.
Okay, so FAPLA,
FAPLA bases, yes.
They were part of the MPLA organization?
Yeah, FAPLA is the Forces Armadas para Liberação de Angola, which is the military wing of the MPLA.
Okay, and these guys were heavily supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba and the like, is that right?
Especially by the Cubans.
Especially by the Cubans.
The Cubans, in fact, were mostly their leader group, the guys
Yep.
that led it, they set up their operations, their planning, their defense, was all done by Cubans. So after I was captured, I was kept in the Cuban military prison
Okay.
in Luanda. So I have never had contact with Angolans when I was in prison, only contact with Cubans.
Okay, right, you're jumping ahead there because
Yeah.
no one knows up to this point
Yeah.
that you've been captured. However, so just to go back, you've deployed, you've walked 21 kilometres to the lying up position through long grasses and
Yes, partly
Beach
so, but then we followed the main road. There was tar road, so we walked on the side of the road, so there was no problems as far as that is concerned, quite easily.
Yep.
Until we left the road, had to go to the east and approach from the east so that we can throw the people off track. Once they start looking at the tracks, we are coming in from the east.
Yep.
But that morning we saw all those places from our height, so the whole day we was very worried about the situation. We realized that the chances that they will pick us up are quite good. So we were counting down the hours.
Were you?
Physically counting down the hours because we knew we can only move once it's dark. Then we can get out. We cannot get out in the middle of the day because we are completely cut off.
Was the plan to continue with the mission?
We probably would have continued with the mission, yes.
Yeah. And so you.
But at about 4:45 that afternoon, the FAPLA forces, they swept through the bushes where our hide were, and then we contact. So they pushed us into the open, and we moved along the edge of this jungle bush that stretched, and then we went into a stopper group of theirs. We went back into the bush, and that's where we split up.
Okay, so there was what, like a platoon's worth of FAPLA guys?
No, more like a company plus.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. And what were they armed with and what were you armed with?
Well, we were mainly armed with silenced weapons because we are doing a raid on this oil installation. So during an operation like that, you actually just use it if you are detected and to keep somebody quiet. We had 2 unsilenced weapons with us, only two AK-47s, and of course the FAPLAs was armed with their RPD machine, normal section machine gun, AKs and RPG-7s.
Okay, so you're heavily outgunned.
Yeah, we were.
Yeah.
Right from the start, we were outgunned. And I mean, you can fire as many shots with a silenced weapon as you want. You're not going to win the firefight because the guy that's making the most noise that is actually winning the firefight. I remember when we were moving back. One RPG-7 came right past us. He hit the ground between us, exploded. In my mind, I can still see the tail fin of the RPG, tumbling through the sky, landed in front of us. And in those initial stages of contact, we had 2 guys that was already wounded, but they kept up at that stage. And when we draw fire again, we moved back into the bush. And that's when we noticed a small ditch-like depression in the earth that leads to a next number of trees and forest and stuff. So we decided to try to get out that way. Myself and Louis van Breda and Roland Liebenberg. We went that way.
Had you agreed to split up into smaller groups
We
at this point?
were divided before the time in smaller groups, but
Yeah.
we have stayed together until that time. When we noticed this the pace and we start moving, we thought that the world group is going to follow behind. Eventually it was just our team. And then we contact again. And both the two guys was killed and I was shot 4 times, wounded 4 times. And yeah, then I was captured there.
Do you have many memories of that moment?
Yes, I do, but you have to go in almost in your subconscious mind to relive that. That's not nice. But of course it was, I remember the 4th time they shot me was after I was taken prisoner, from a distance about this far from my face, the AK. Then a guy wants to cut my throat with a knife, or AK bayonet. And he was stopped by the Oak in command, and that's when they realized, listen, but this guy is not black people, this is white people. That changed the scenario very quickly, and they wanted to get me out of this combat area as quickly as possible.
Did you hear, were you able to detect who they thought you were? Did they think you were South Africans or mercenaries?
Mercenaries.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
mercenaries. Now the 2 guys that was with me were already dead at that stage, and the other guys was just about 50 meters away in the thick bush where they waited out. But now there was a lot of confusion in the ranks of the enemy as well. They didn't know exactly, is there a guy that has already passed, are we the tail part or are we the first part? So they did not continue their search for the rest of the guys at that stage. At least it delayed this action long enough for darkness to fall. And then after darkness, those other 6 guys, they got out. They went to the emergency RV area where they were picked up by the rubber boats, taken back to the submarine, where the doctor operated on the 2 wounded guys. Both of them made it, and they came back for 3 consecutive nights afterwards to try and find us, to see whether we have perhaps reached the emergency RV spots. So they came back. We said a lot of the guys. But yeah, by that time we were gone, taken to Cabinda, the capital of the province of Cabinda. That was very difficult because that stage my hands was tied and I was loaded on the back of a truck, and at all the roadblocks they will stop, and then I'm like a trophy which they show to all the people, and of course everybody wants to get in a punch. I remember when we drove into Cabinda itself, I was thrown off the truck in the military base, and you always tend to fall on your injuries.
So where had you been shot?
This arm of mine was broken, was shot through here,
Yeah.
and then 2 shots through my shoulder and 1 in the neck, which I was lucky to survive. But anyway, so whenever they throw you off the truck, you land on this injured shoulder. It just works that way. I remember lying there on the ground, and I saw this ring of army boots standing around me. Then I was uploaded again, and I was taken to some official building in Cabinda, lying there on a little stage, watching the blood run over the edge of the steps, and then down the next one, and down the next one. And finally the governor, I presume it was the governor of the province, and the chief of the army in that province, they all arrived. They had lots of discussions. Then I was taken away where they did the tactical interrogation. We came in, they put me on a bench, and everybody leaves the room. The next guy came in, he kicked the bench out from under me and said, why are you sitting on the bench? The next guy will come in and say, why are you on the ground? And he kick you back onto the bench. And then you became like a intoxicated person. You just go with the flow. No matter what you do, or they do, you just go with it. Then, after a very long time, they took me to a room under lights where they started the interrogation, asking questions. But for 2 hours they tried to persuade me that I do understand Portuguese, which I didn't. Or not at the time anyway. And finally they got hold of a translator, which English wasn't very good. And so now they ask me the questions through the translator. And of course the first things they wanted to know is, how did you get here? Where the story of the parachutes now come in. And then from that, where is your emergency always? Because they know these guys has escaped. So where can they go and pick them up at the emergency always? So now it becomes more difficult. Because all the real emergency RVs for this operation was next to the coast.
Yeah.
So I revert back to infantry tactics, where you walk on a patrol and you will point out certain outstanding trees or land features as your emergency RV. And while I was doing that, as this guy is translating, there in the corner on a steel cabinet was one Cuban sitting. And he confirmed. He said, yeah, we are doing it like that as well. So they did not ask anything more about it. So when they ask me something and I tell them infantry tactics, this guy every time confirms what I'm saying. So I realized at that stage, but I was just stuck to infantry tactics. Because here's an alibi. He's confirming everything I'm telling them. So it continued for a long time. And
had you received first aid?
No, nothing at that stage. And we are now talking about 3 o'clock the next morning, 3, 4 o'clock the next morning, when I finally got the opportunity to tell this translator that, listen, my arm is broken. And he asked me, how do I know? I said, because you twisted it twice before they tied my hands, and it's painful. At that stage, they sent for a doctor, the Cuban doctor. This guy's arrived, young national serviceman from Cuba, and they checked it and they say, yes, it's broken. Then they cut the ties around my head, and then they could see. At that moment, they took over, because they demand that I now go to the hospital because they want to operate. They have to, according to them. That saved me from further interrogation. And I was loaded into an ambulance and then taken up to that medical post. I remember lying on a steel table with a single globe dangling from the roof, and one guy was injecting me something on this side and the other guy was straightening this arm on a plank. And I remember screaming of the pain, and then I was out. When I came to the next day, sometime the next day, I was actually handcuffed to a bed, hospital bed, and my whole chest was in not bandages, when you broke an arm, a cast.
Yeah.
Interesting, about 3 weeks later I feel a terrible pain at the back, this side here. And they came and they cut a little hole in there, and they found another bullet hole which they haven't treated as yet, so they treated that. But I must take off my hats to the Cuban doctors. They were also just national servicemen. The easiest way would have to put the arm off, because they didn't have a splint for upper arm. They only had a leg splint, and they put it in here so it stick out at the top. But it saved my arm. So they did very well in the process. About 7-8 days after I was captured, I was then displayed to the international press. And
why do you think they did that?
say again?
Why? Was that just the way things were done?
Oh, for
back then?
them, it's you must remember at that stage there was supposed to be no South Africans in Angola.
Okay, so you disclose that now.
Yeah, so this is now world news.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got proof that South Africans is in Angola. So it was a big thing internationally. But that was also the point where I knew or realized that now I'm safe. Because once they have displayed you to the international press, then they must protect you so that nothing happens to you. Because if something did happen to me while I was in prison, South Africa would use it to their advantage about how the Angolans are treating the prisoners. So now I'm becoming a play ball between the two of them.
Were you allowed to answer journalist questions at the...
Yes, of course, but you must remember that the journalist there that was in that press conference, they hate South Africans. So I had a very, very hard time to protect myself and the country in what I was saying, you know, and the way how they were asking the questions. Of course, you are exporting fascism to Angola and to the rest of Africa, and all the stories and things which you can expect. A couple of months down the line, Jesse Jackson arrived in Angola.
Oh.
Now Jesse Jackson at that stage, he was running for president of the United States. And part of his election campaign he visited Africa, specifically Angola and South Africa. I can only think that he visited Angola because I was in prison there. But he wanted to use this. And he also arrived there with a youth journalist contingent. It's TV cameras and things, and there I was sitting. And this horde of journalists asking me questions. And I really had to battle to state South Africa's case. And I did that. I did that very well. But after a while, Jesse Jackson saw that, listen, this humiliation process that he wants to go through is not going according to plan. So now he steps forward, coming and stands right in front of me as far as this table, screaming into my face about how bad person I am to be in the South Africa Defence Force and for being in Angola and things like that. So I got extremely upset. But we went successfully through it. And when we were driving back to the prison, was stuck between two Cubans. And the one guy was a colonel, lieutenant colonel, and he looked at me and said, man, who the fuck is Jesse Jackson? Sort of, he's now sympathizing with me because Jesse Jackson was trying to make such a big thing of it. Eventually, after I came back to South Africa in 1987, a Portuguese sculptor has made a sculpture for me called Prisoner of War. He said he was inspired to make that sculpture because of the interview with Jesse Jackson. I still got it. It's extremely interesting. But yeah, the time in prison, of course, was difficult. Difficult to accept what has happened to me. It was difficult to accept that the operation has failed, that I, in fact, failed the operation, that some of my men was killed, of which one actually came here for Somerset West. He's buried here in this town.
So how did you deal with that? Those feelings. You
Well,
were in solitary confinement, is that right?
yes.
For the large part?
For the whole period of time, I was kept in solitary confinement.
And how long was the whole period?
Well, that's about 835 or something days. Yeah,
So almost 3 years.
almost 3 years. Yeah,
So 2.5 years or so.
2.5 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I complained about it one day, and I said to the OC of the base, when he came to the cell to inspect the things, and I said to him, I want to go to a normal prison where I can have other prisoners to communicate with. And of course they refused. Later on, I was actually glad about it, because otherwise, you know, there's other dangers in a normal Angolan criminal prison. So in a certain sense, the Cubans did not give me bad food because I'm a prisoner. I was the only prisoner, so I got the same food that their base personnel was getting. So the food was acceptable, it was nice, you know, edible, but very little. And I lost 30 kilograms during the time that I was in prison. That's about 40 kilograms less than I'm weighing now at this stage, yeah. But anyway, I survived it, and I was very glad about it eventually.
Do you think your training prepared you sufficiently for that?
No, I don't think so. How do you prepare anybody to go to prison?
Well, I guess the initial interrogation period, to start with?
What I will tell you, the psychological selection of the Special Forces is of such a high standard that all guys that qualify in the Special Forces in South Africa would probably have done equally good or bad as I did in prison, because of your psychological state. If you look at the guys who really suffered from PTSD after the war, you were very, very few Special Forces guys have been affected by it. The normal troops, yes, normal oaks, they went for their national service, but we were psychologically better prepared.
Yeah.
Now, interesting, when you ask me about the training, you are only trained how to take a prisoner. The steps you go through when you take a prisoner. But that was exactly the same steps that they took with me. And while this whole thing was playing off, I kept hearing the voice of our chief instructor telling me, this is what's going to happen. Take off your boots, or his boots, and then they cut the laces off, they take off my boots. Exactly, you know, I could hear his voice in my head. The go now principle. Go now. If there is opportunity to escape, you must go now. Because the further along you go up the line, the less your chances to get away become. But also the safer you become. You understand?
Yeah.
In the process. I must say that thought gave me some comfort. The fact that I've kept on hearing this guy's voice during that whole process. Until almost when I went into hospital. I also knew from once they've shown you to the international press, then you will be safe. And that worked out that way. But for me a big problem was the fact that I never knew how long I was going to spend in prison. That's difficult because under normal circumstances you would go to a court and they will give you 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. Then at least you know and you can psychologically prep yourself for that. But being a prisoner of war, you never knew how long you are going to be there. And just remember, they never recognized me as a prisoner of war.
What did that have, a positive or a negative effect?
In this stage, negative. Positive, then they have to adapt to the rules of the international community.
Yep.
Because a prisoner of war got certain rights which cannot be impeached on. in my case, they say I'm not recognized as a prisoner of war because there's not a declaration of war between South Africa and Angola. But when the International Red Cross demanded from the Angolan government that they do recognize me, the Angolan government said, no, we are going to do something better. We are going to invite his wife to come for a visit. So 3 times he visited me while I was in prison. So that's better than sticking to the international convention to a certain extent. So, but they played that role all the way, not to become or not to be in the position where they had to recognize me as a prisoner of war.
Did they ever find out the truth about the mission, the fact that you were in For Recce?
They did no. They didn't understand the Recce stuff, the Special Forces stuff. They up to today they never knew that we went there in a submarine. They did eventually find out that we did came from the sea, but we came by ship. That I actually told them, we came by sea, but never about the submarine. Also, the fact that I was in the Special Forces, the implications of that, they did never realize that. So I was never questioned about Special Forces tactics, the way how we operate, the operations that we normally do. They were more interested in the operational deployment of the South African forces on the Angolan border, on the Namibian side. But that I don't know, because I was deployed from the sea. So I never knew the normal army deployments of the South African Defence Force along the border.
Did you grow to like your captors?
No, you don't like them. But you see, the moment that you start building up a sort of a position, or not a position of trust, but when you start feeling, or when one of the guards starts displaying goodness to you, becoming
humanity kind of.
Yes, then they were normally taken away.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah, so never longer than 3 months were specific people allowed to be in contact with me, then they were swapped. By the end of the time, the guys who was guarding me did not even knew what I was doing in Angola, why I was captured. They didn't know that story. You know, it's neo-national servicemen that came from Cuba. But on senior level, there was one specific guy, I believe he was probably in psychological warfare, who was in charge of the setup. He remained the same throughout. When I left finally back for South Africa on that day when the news broke, he gave me a bottle of Cuban rum to bring back home, and I gave him one of the books that my wife bought, which he took to Cuba. There was only one journalist ever allowed to talk to me while I was in the cell, and it was a Cuban journalist.
Okay.
And many years later, I'm now talking around about 2003, 2004, I received a request. There's a Cuban journalist that wants to do a TV interview with me. It was the same guy.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And then you are experience a sense of connection with this guy, because he was there under that circumstances. But looking back on the war now, is so many years ago, that there's no hard feelings left. You know, I've been back to Angola many times, spent a lot of time with the Angolan military guys, and eventually they are just soldiers exactly the same as us. It's the ideologies and politics that cause the wars and
sure.
cause us to differ.
You talked briefly about escape opportunities. Obviously you were severely injured in the initial period at least. Did you keep on looking for opportunities, and what would you have been prepared to do to escape?
Well, that was a difficult part, because there's two sets of doors on the cell itself, but both are airlock systems. They have to go through one door and then through another door. And the key of that door never comes with this guy to this door. There's always an armed guard on each side. And I never knew how I was going to do it. I tried to go through the wall, break through the wall, but it was solid cast concrete, so that did not work out well. After 3 months I haven't even scratched the surface properly, so I abandoned that effort. But then one night there was a thunderstorm, a huge thunderstorm, and I saw no one. And I started calling. Nothing, no one in sight. So I took the steel chair that I got there and I started heating the bars, and no one responded. And that's when I realized, if there is a severe thunderstorm, there's not enough space for the guards to hide against the rain. Then they move away.
Okay.
So I realized that it's possible to break a lock if it happens in a storm. I tested a couple of times, and every time the same thing happened. So now I need something strong enough and long enough to have leverage to break the, the padlock locks on the door. And the bed was actually, had a lot of parts that was screwed together. And I noticed that if I took off this part that is keeping the leg open, and I'm using one of the legs extensions, and I put the two together, I got a fairly long one, so that cannot work, right. But what about shoes? So I start threading the towel to make a rope with it, use all the threads together, make boots out of a blanket, just to protect your feet until you can get to a place where you can get boots or take it from somebody. Later on there were some guards at night sleeping in the cell next to me. I climbed up to the top of the bars and I put my arm around. They put their stuff there on top. So I steal a magazine full of AK ammunition, then I took out one round each night. So I had a lot of rounds. Blades, shaving blades.
Yep.
Many I found there on top. Needles and stuff I found there, and all go into one of the legs of the bed. And with that I could do something. The ball in the toilet can serve as a water bottle.
Yep.
If you air inside, water bottle. But then you are always faced with the possibility, how do you know you break out tonight and you're not going to be released tomorrow? Once you break out, you've got to flee, and you've got to flee very far. My idea was to flee to the port, not away from them, but into the midst of the city, and then down in the port and stow away on the ship. Probably end up in Portugal or a place like that. But that was my plan. Eventually, it did not happen. I did not escape. I took old bread and put it so it can dry out in sunlight to make the biscuits. It tasted like shit, but anyway, I did that.
And one day, you received a visit from a fairly mysterious French fellow.
Yeah, actually in 1986 already I received this visit by the Frenchman, and they did not explain to me why he was there. This Frenchman's name is Jean-Yves Olivier, and we did not met at the prison. It took me to to a sort of a guest house, put me up there. And the Frenchman came in and we chatted, and he did not really introduce himself. And he just said, "I'm a friend of your people." And he asked me how I was, how I feel, what I experience, etc. And he gave me a letter for my wife. And while I was there, he gave me paper and a pen to reply. And I wrote a quick reply there to my wife. He's now going back to South Africa. He's going to take it to the family. And then when I going to give the pen back to him, he said, "No, keep it." But it's quite an expensive pen, even, you know, ink pen, but a golden spray pen. Probably if you have to buy that pen now, it will be in the vicinity of around about 2,000 US. That's an expensive pen.
Yeah.
He later explained, "I gave me the pen as a token that he wanted to do something for me." That's what he said. Well, and then he left. I was quite confused, because here is this Frenchman. I don't understand why, what is his interest. But still, it sparkles a bit of hope that yes, at least here is somebody coming from somewhere who is going back to South Africa, or is going to South Africa, who now has taken an interest in the situation. Because you don't hear anything. You don't know if anything is being done. All I know is that the government has rejected my existence, and that I am part of the South African Army and that type of normal procedure. Then, exactly a year later, he popped up again. And that day he had another guy with him, a guy called Dion Erasmus. He was a medical doctor, but he's also a Special Forces operator. But he was with me in Cabinda. And we did the operation, but he stayed in the boats. So he wasn't part of the shore party. And here Dion is with him. Dion standing in the door, looking at me, and I look at him. I recognized him immediately. But I realized also, listen, Dion, you was with us there in Cabinda. If I recognize you here, they will come and ask me, "From where do you recognize that guy?" I said, "You'll end up in prison as well." That worried them. When they came back to South Africa, they said they don't know whether I have recognized it. But the Frenchman asked me, "Did you recognize him?" I said, "Yes." But somehow that wasn't relayed. That was about 10 days before I was released. I was watching television one Sunday evening. I got a small black and white television just outside the cell. So I was watching it. And I saw there they explained that, as far as I can understand, from the little bit of Portuguese I know at that stage, is that I'm going to be released. I'm going to exchange for prisoners. And I called the Cuban guard, because I was speaking more Spanish than Portuguese. And I asked him, "What are they saying there?" And he confirms to me. He said to me, "Tomorrow you are going home." So now I can't sleep. I'm waiting now for this magic moment that's going to happen tomorrow morning. The next day nothing happens. Nothing happens. Everything is as normal. I didn't know what was going on. Yes, and my pulse rate was up. And exactly 12 o'clock, I heard footsteps. And then the base commander, the Cuban base commander, was standing in the door. He said, "Captain, your time has come, you are going home." And then quickly they cut my hair and my beard and gave me clothes to put on. And then I left the cell into a car. For the first time I wasn't cuffed. Then I get into the car, taken to the airport. I had to make a television statement there for the Angolan television. And then I was led to a plane, put on the plane. The plane belonged to the Angolan president, a Gulfstream. And inside was Jaan Ives. And then we chat as we took off from Luanda. We flew to Maputo. And in Maputo I was exchanged for 132 FAPLA soldiers, and Pierre Albertini, a Frenchman, and Klaas de Jong, a Dutchman, who was being held for weapon smuggling in South Africa. And so it was quite a large exchange of prisoners.
So you flew in, was it daytime or nighttime? Or?
It was supposed to be daytime, but we touched down in Maputo just as the sun was setting.
Yeah.
At that stage we were already supposed to have exchanged. The South African Air Force has already scrambled their Mirages to intercept the Angolan plane in case they're going to miss the landing. So there's a lot of contingency planning to prevent them from flying back to Angola.
Right.
Yeah.
So you land, you look out, the sun's going down at the Maputo in Mozambique, the airport there, and you said 130 plus prisoners getting exchanged. Were they at the airport as well?
Yeah, they flew in with a Boeing from South Africa.
Yeah.
They landed there, they were sitting on that side of the tarmac, I was sitting on this side, and then all the other exchange planes somewhere. And we spent a long time at the airport as the final documents was being signed and speeches was delivered. And then eventually it was long after dark. I had to walk from the Angolan Gulf Stream towards the other side of the tarmac where the South African president's plane was parked. And halfway we crossed. The Angolan prisoners going that way and me going to the South African side. What is that?
There was a grasshopper.
Oh, there is.
Yeah.
And from there we flew actually to Cape Town here. And I saw the state president that night at about 12:30.
So you've gone from, within the space of a few hours, you've gone from a little solitary confinement cell with black and white TV through a cage door to going on one president's Gulfstream to another president's Boeing or something or other.
And then right down to his house here in Cape Town, where I was met by him and several ministers. And I made a little speech to the press. And then the president asked them if they have any questions, and each and every hand goes up. And he looked at them and said, "Oh, no questions, let's go." So we went through to his office, and they asked me if I want to drink something. I said, yes, I would like a brandy. And I drank my first brandy after I was released with the President of South Africa.
What were your emotions at this point?
Yes, it's undescribable. I mean, from the moment I stepped out of the prison in Angola until after I've met P.W. Botha, was one high. And the next day was hectic as well. I met my family at the hospital the day after they operated and took the spin out. And then about a week later, I couldn't remember anything. It was like a computer that have received too much input over too short a period of time, and it just shuts off. I started remembering my homecoming again after about 3 months. Things started getting back. Oh, that's what we did, and there we were. And it was quite hectic. But I can tell you, it's a great feeling when you were in prison and you came out and you came back to your country. And I was very well received by the president, by the government, and by all the people of South Africa, because this whole process was broadcast for a full day as the steps, as we arrived in Maputo, as we left Maputo, it was broadcast live to South Africa.
So, I mean, you were given the quintessential hero's welcome, I suppose. Did you feel like a hero?
No, and I couldn't understand what was happening.
Yeah.
That was a difficult thing. for me. Because all the previous guys that was captured was flown back to South Africa or pushed across the border. One guy was exchanged in Germany for a Russian, but not a lot of press coverage, just sort of reporting the guy, they are back.
Mm.
And here I came and they make this very, very large propaganda thing out of it. Of course they wanted probably the mileage out of it. But I discuss some of my theories in the books that I've written since. So it pretty much put me on the map.
Mm.
But then for years I have gone quiet, almost underground, as I lived my own life and struggled to overcome the problems that sprout out of this incident. Farming in Namibia, farming here, farming in Namibia. Then I went back to Angola with executive outcomes. Then I remained behind. I farmed in Angola, lived there for 6-7 years. Came back to South Africa, and I was very confused of sort of between the countries, and I couldn't find my feet.
Was that
Probably.
the main thing that incarceration period did to you? Did it leave
Yes.
you unsettled?
Yes, it did. For example, I spent 2.5 years in prison. And from there on, my life took on 2.5 year cycles. So for 2.5 years I will be here doing this. Then something will happen. Then I spend another 2.5 years doing that, and that will stop. And then something else. My whole life turned up to be broken up in short periods of 2.5 years.
Mm.
And that must have been a psychological thing, which I only broke in 2011 when I went to the Congo. But it was while I was farming in the Congo that I was invited to attend the 25th anniversary of the signage of the Brazzaville Protocol.
Okay, quickly explain what the original Brazzaville Protocol was.
Yeah. I only find out that there exists something like the Brazzaville Protocol in 2014. But the Brazzaville Protocol was not advocated in South Africa. The people was not informed about it. But the Brazzaville Protocol was where the end of the war was decided, how they was going to end the war. That was the initial planning phases for how they are going to do it. The end of the war, the withdrawal of the Cubans, the withdrawal of the South Africans, independence of Namibia, which was preconditioned for the release of Nelson Mandela. If you look at the Plot for Peace, which was that day's premiere of Plot for Peace, was on that celebration day of the signage, 35th anniversary of Brazzaville Protocol, then you can see how they have gone through the planning phases, and that the whole process only stopped after Nelson Mandela was released.
Okay. Now, just for listeners, Plot for Peace is a film about the role of Jean-Yves Olivier.
Exactly.
Yeah.
About his life.
Okay.
But I never knew it until I saw it. I never knew about the Brazzaville Protocol until I, in the Congo, in Brazzaville, learned about it, and where the first stipulation was the release of prisoners. And that's when everything sorts of, all the missing pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. That's when I realized that our operation in Cabinda was a setup to create a platform, a vehicle for the negotiations of peace, of the end of the war. That's where I finally realized what was the issue. why we had to wait for everything to fall into place, why we must be isolated, why we had to spend the day ashore, why we have to be on the eastern side of the installation.
So you're saying
They wanted prisoners to be taken. While I was in prison, during one of my wife's visits, she was hosted by the Congo government. At that stage, still the Popular Republic of the Congo. What does they have to do with the war in Angola? What does they have to do with a prisoner of war, a South African prisoner of war, or a soldier that is being kept in prison in Angola? But they hosted her. They drove her around in the embassy car. They accommodated her and provided her with food for the whole stay. And it's only after 2014 that I realized the role that Brazzaville, Congo has played in the end of the war with the negotiations. This was where the plans was made. And all of a sudden it sounds as if I was part of Plot for Peace. I was part of this whole process and I didn't even know it. I received the National Order of Merit of the Congo on that evening of the 25th anniversary of the Brazzaville Protocol from the President of the Congo for the little role I played in the release of Nelson Mandela. And I was only a prisoner. I was in prison. I did not even know what was going on. So this was a whole planned operation.
So just let me, to be clear, part of the, if you look at the sort of the political, the geopolitics at play, the writing was on the wall for South Africa, the demise of apartheid. Things had to change. Part of that was the release of Nelson Mandela.
Yes.
Right?
But the problem with South Africa was that the process was being pushed ripe. It wasn't necessary at that stage to do it. Contrary to the now very popular belief, we never fought a war against the ANC or the Umkhonto we Sizwe. They were never in the trenches in Angola. They never fought there. They were trained there, but they never fought. They refused to fight. We should have fought the ANC. Then we would have had a better position in South Africa today than we have now. But yes, I wouldn't say that we couldn't continue as it was. We could have continued for another 10, 15 years easily.
Mm.
But the politics played it out that the time is right, that it must be done. I don't want to say a lot about the politics. We lost, we won the war, we won the battles, but we lost the overall war from a military perspective.
Okay.
Because eventually politics lost the war for us. But we could have continued.
Okay, so part of the deal was that there was a big push to have Mandela released. But if we read between the lines, or more explicitly, saying that, okay, well, let's have some sort of prisoner exchange to be part of that.
Well, let's look at the facts. PW was not against the release of Mandela, PW Botha. But he said the conditions must be right.
Yep.
And he said that at that stage it was not yet right. PW did not know about our operation in Cabinda. He was extremely angry when he found out after the news became known that we have been captured, or I have been captured. Now you must go back to my very first question, why select the American target? PW's only support was the Americans. Then he lost the support. Mm. So was that a quasi-decision made by someone in an effort to push PW to resign? Because very shortly after I was released, he did resign. And F.W. Klerk came into power. And within 6 months, he announced the release of Nelson Mandela. That period was too fast, too quickly, according to me and many others. That should have been a more prolonged process, but it was as if they were chasing a date somewhere in 1994. It must happen before that, or what is the or?
And part of one of the first steps had to be the loss of American support to precipitate these.
Well, that was a way to put pressure on PW to change.
Yep.
That's what I'm aiming at with my first 2 books. Judas Bok and USS Cleared, where I explain the operation and everything that we have talked about now. Explain in a lot of detail on what I think happened. But then again, you must ask the question, how certain were they that they will have a prisoner taken?
Yeah, sure.
But because of the isolation, they wanted to take the whole group prisoner, because that would have given them so much more power to negotiate, instead of only 1 or 2. Fortunately, in this scenario, I was a very senior captain in the Special Forces. But there was a backup operation that has been planned and which were executed on the very same night, and that was the attack on the Air Force base at Manonk, where the people had to infiltrate the base to sabotage the planes. After watching it for months, all of a sudden, that specific night, all the guards personnel was not doubled, but tripled. They were swarming that base. So one of the operations was supposed to deliver a prisoner, preferably the whole group as prisoners.
Did that operation go ahead? The airfield one?
It did. But they abandoned it. The moment they noticed this unusual activities, they abandoned the attack.
So, look, it's a pretty big accusation. You're basically saying that someone in your
People
government,
don't like what I'm saying.
yeah, has basically shopped you, has betrayed you. In fact, the name of your book here, and we'll talk about it in a moment, Judas Goat, which I found fascinating when I looked up what it meant. So, do you want to explain what that means, and in the context of what we've been talking about?
At the abattoir, when the farmers' trucks arrive with the sheep to be slaughtered, they are offloaded in a pen. And then, through a little false door, a big goat comes in. And then this goat walks in front of the sheep, and all the sheep follow this goat through like a walkway, until the pen where they are being slaughtered. There you got another false door, and you go out that door. That's called the Judas Goat. He's leading the sheep to the slaughterhouse. And I'm saying that this operation was to lead the people of South Africa to the slaughterhouse.
So you've published the book. You've been quite outspoken about what you believe. Some people don't like it. Some people agree with you. How has it changed your life?
I made a lot of enemies in the process, but it's more the people that don't want to hear that anything like this could have happened in the previous times. So there's many examples of things that went wrong and which was done wrong. And it was much easier to blame the failure of this whole operation on me. So for 30 years I walked around until I, by accident, were invited to the 25th anniversary of the signage of the Brazzaville Protocol, and here I learned what has happened. And then after 30 years I realized, but I'm not solely to blame for the failure of that operation. Because very easy to say, but it's his fault, it's his mistake. He was the mission commander, he made the wrong decisions. But then all of a sudden the questions about why I make their decisions become clear. That's when I decided to write these 2 books.
Were you bitter at all for a period of time?
No, I'm not bitter. I mean, it's too many years.
Yeah.
It's already passed. Remember, if I look back at my life now, and many times I'm being asked by youngsters where they ask me if I had to relive my life, is there anything I would want to take out of my life? I said no. Because if I've taken anything out, then I wouldn't have been who I am now. I needed all that to be Wynand du Toit today. Because the problems and the obstacles in your life define who you become and who you are now. So for me that is important. So I cannot be bitter about it. No, there's too many positive things around us. We are alive, must carry on, be thankful, grateful for everything. But these 2 books also opened a new door for me. These books went so well, I sold tremendous large number of the book. So that the people say, but they like to reading the style. So I wrote another book about submarines, by the way. That went down well, and I wrote another book and another one. Now there is already 7 books. In 2.5 years since I started writing, I'm living solely from the income of my books. Again, that is not something that you seldomly see happening. I talk to people about this experience, but not about the negative things, but about the fact that adverse situations, problems, obstacles is not necessarily a bad thing in your life. We all have problems. We all experience obstacles. There's not one person in the world that don't experience problems of the one or another kind. But life is not supposed to be easy. Life is supposed to exist out of obstacles and problems which you must overcome to become the person that you will be one day. If that makes sense.
Makes perfect sense. Look, that's a positive note to wrap up, Wynand. But before we do, let's quickly make sure, if ever this makes the video, normally I do the audio version first, but it's called Judascope. This is the first book.
This is the first one, yes.
Which describes, as we say, the operation in great detail. Where can people get this?
Well, it is available in most bookshops in South Africa.
Yep.
Or they can order it directly from me, which then I will personalize it and sign it for them. And the email address is MRS FDT, which stands for Mrs. Francis du Toit,
okay.
at gmail.com. That was my wife's idea.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, Mrs. FDT, Francis du Toit, MRS FDT at gmail.com.
What about an e-version? An electronic version?
There is an electronic version on www.kobo.com.
Kobo with a K.
Kobo with
okay,
a K,
I'll
yes.
make sure those links go up as well on the website,
Okay.
where people can download the podcast.
And then, of course, my own website is also there, just wynanddutoit.com.
Perfect. Wynand, thank you so much. It's a fascinating
Richard,
story.
It's a pleasure. I hope that answers all your questions, but there's such a lot that we can talk about.
Oh, I'm sure.
We can probably fill another 2-3 programs.
Well, maybe another podcast in the future.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.